Good morning, everyone. Wow, what a great morning to be out. It is my great honor and a pleasure to welcome you to Session 1, Energy Policy and Artificial Worlds, Simulation as Strategy. My name is Daniel Xue, and I'm a graduate student in the MIT Technology and Policy Program, class of 2026. My research, in coordination with the MIT Energy Initiative, or MITI, largely focuses on advanced optimization and decomposition methods for energy systems modeling, with applications for low-carbon fuel production for sustainable aviation and shipping, long-term energy storage, and fuel cell deployment. This morning's session will examine leading-edge research and translation in energy policy modeling, explore the opportunities and challenges for how simulation is evolving into a rigorous, participatory, and transformative research architecture, one that integrates human and technological complexity, addresses power inequity, bridges disciplinary divides, and illuminates pathways toward sustainable energy futures. We are very delighted to be joined by an extraordinary panel of MIT and TPP alumni, leaders in technology and policy whose work spans academia, government, industry, and the nonprofit sector. So first, on our very right, Graham Turk will serve as our moderator. He is a regulatory program manager at the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, PURA, where he plays a strategic leadership role in shaping Connecticut's energy regulatory landscape. PURA is a quasi-judicial agency that interprets and applies the statutes and regulations governing all aspects of Connecticut's utility sector, with a central role in advancing the modernization of the electric distribution system. Integrating clean energy technologies, designing rate structures, and overseeing programs that support grid reliability, decarbonization, and affordability. Next, Bethany Patten is the executive director of the MIT Climate Policy Center and a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She leads strategic efforts to connect MIT's climate research with policymakers across all levels of government. Her work centers on translating academic insights into real-world climate action with the focus on several initial policy areas: improving the electric power grid, climate and trade, transportation, and reducing building-related carbon emissions. Next, Erin serves as the Clean Grid Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, bringing decades of experience in the clean energy industry to support the mission of ELM and thoughtfully advocating for policy and strategic partnerships that meets the scale and urgency of our environmental challenges. Set Massachusetts on a just course to a net zero economy and protect natural resources for future generations. Next, Dr. Nestor Sepulveda is the commercial lead for advanced energy investments and partnerships at Google. Nestor is a leading expert in energy transition strategy, sustainable and clean energy investing, economic and risk analysis of decarbonization pathways, and long-term energy system modeling, combining operations research, machine learning, and statistical analysis. Tory is a partner at Energy and Environmental Economics, E3, and she is an expert in energy policy planning and climate mitigation analysis and works with state agencies, NGOs, and utilities that are planning policy and investment decisions for deep decarbonization. She leads E3's Climate Pathways and Electrification Practice area, which explores deep decarbonization for states, regions, and utilities with a focus on climate policy, building electrification, and transportation electrification strategy, as well as future natural gas distribution and load forecasting. And finally, Dr. Franck is the Climate Modeling and Policy Director at the Climate Policy Lab and Assistant Research Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His expertise lies in system dynamics modeling for climate policy, including tools like En-ROADS and C-ROADS, which has been used globally to inform climate negotiations and policy decisions. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel. Okay. We look forward to stimulating discussion on how simulation and modeling, as advanced research and analytical tools, can be used as strategic instruments for shaping the energy systems of the future. It is now my pleasure to turn the conversation over to our moderator, Graham Turk, who will guide us through this session.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. We're going to start with a little introduction from each of our panelists and then dive into the discussion and hopefully open it up to questions. So we'll start with Bethany.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So I'm going to start by talking about the hero of our story, who is a TPP student, graduated in the 90s. His name is Drew Jones. I don't know if any of you know him. I hope you do. Drew, when he was a student here, discovered that there was a model that was looking at the energy and climate system that was so inaccessible that the insights from it were just collecting dust on a shelf. And this was a model that was designed by Professor John Sterman. It started during his work on his PhD dissertation, also here at MIT. And it was something that John was using and students were using, but was not accessible at all to the public. And Drew said, you know what? I would really like to take this model and I would like to turn it into something that everybody globally can use. And so when he graduated, he formed the nonprofit think tank called Climate Interactive. And Climate Interactive took that model and put a skin on it, created an app for it, and made it a model that now I think we have, what, Travis, over almost like 800,000 people have seen globally, which is a huge feat. And the thing with the En-ROADS model is that it allows people to learn for themselves what are the high and low leverage climate policies that can get us to reducing emissions in time. So at the time that I met Drew, I was working at MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative, and we were doing a lot of education and trying to get students to think about their career pathways and sustainability. And so we used En-ROADS in our classrooms as a way for students to get a little bit more familiar with these high and low leverage policies. And what we noticed was that there was that every time students interacted with this model, they were just really energized and wanted to do something. And we figured, you know, if we could get students this excited about it, what would happen if we took this model and we focused on leaders and started to talk to leaders about engaging with the model? And so I think it was probably it was probably 6 years ago, we had our first meeting with a group of 37 US senators, and we ran a workshop using the En-ROADS model. And we thought it was going to be a 5-minute meeting, and it ended up being almost an hour. And we had senators jumping out of their seats, shouting out, "Move this lever, what if we tried this?" And then they engaged in debate among themselves over which policies were the best policies to try, and then engaged in dialogue with each other about ideas that they hadn't exchanged before. And that kicked off a series of meetings that continue to this day, and a project that we launched called the MIT Climate Pathways Project. And the project uses interactive models to engage leaders to have these kinds of conversations in safe environments. And it's not just leaders in government, but we work in the entire policy ecosystem using this model. So we feel like it's a really fabulous story that takes, you know, something that was happening at MIT that really wasn't going to have impact, turned it into something that was accessible for everyone, and then created a opportunity for people to engage in complex topics, but very simply, and to learn for themselves. So the best part about the model is that you get to actually move the levers yourselves, and you learn in real time, and you get to experiment. And our Professor Sterman always says, you know, be a good scientist when people interact with the models. And so I'll leave it at that to say that, you know, our goal is to make all of the data visible for everyone and give everyone an opportunity to be able to learn for themselves. And I'll hand it over to Erin.
Thanks so much, Bethany. Yep, we'll move on to Erin.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Excited to be here. I'm going to first talk about some of the ways that energy economic modeling has shown up in my career and how that is sort of manifesting today. So when I was a student at TPP, I wrote my thesis on how to leverage large macro-scale energy economic models of the global climate system and the role that carbon capture and storage technologies would have in future climate pathways. After TPP, I went on to work in a consulting practice where we really specialized in forecasting the renewable energy credit prices across the New England states and New York. And now my current role, I serve as a clean grid director at an environmental nonprofit where I advocate for clean energy policies that will both decarbonize our grid as well as achieve affordability for people that pay for it. And modeling is showing up in my current trajectory, particularly with, as I think the hot topic of the day is AI and data centers and the impact that's having on load growth. And by extension, the impact that those load growth projections may have on consumer bills if AI and data centers connect to the grid. And so with all of this kind of in mind, I think I've really grasped the pivotal role and I think powerful tools and capabilities that energy economic modeling can have in informing really valuable insights. At the same time, I think we're all pretty familiar with the quote by statistician George Box that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And with that in mind, I also, I think, have come to grasp some of the important limitations and caveats that's important to capture in modeling and how we communicate that with the stakeholders that are trying to use our models as well. So with particular sort of reference to the sort of limits of models is they're functionally a function of their input assumptions. And models are notoriously bad at predicting disruptive innovations, including AI that's now transforming the electric industry. And I bring up these limitations with regard to my work on state-level advocacy, with particular reference to the electric grid. Some of the forecasts of demand growth from AI and data centers have a risk of not actually materializing, and then consumers and ratepayers are on the hook for potential grid upgrades and generation builds that don't actually need to be powered if this AI and data center doesn't materialize as forecasted. By the same token, there's also a risk of underbuilding if demand is in fact higher than what our models are predicting. And then our consumers will face reliability shortfalls and further affordability risks. And I bring these dynamics up with recognition of how I communicate with state-level policymakers, and this includes state regulators, this includes state legislators, governors, staff, as well as state energy offices. And all of those players have different levels of understanding of not only the energy system, but just energy economic modeling as a tool that they can use. And so I want to talk about that in terms of the importance in how we translate model inputs and how we operate those models and how we leverage the findings. I want to mention state legislators in particular, because unlike some of the regulators at a state utility commission, their knowledge of energy principles is fairly limited. Obviously there's variation, but on the whole, these legislators are having to deal with a lot of different topics. And so understanding the energy system is not necessarily something that you can count on when you're in their offices. And so it's important to be able to simplify and to translate some of the inputs and outputs of these models. But I think it's important to contextualize that simplifying and translating is not the same as dumbing something down. And I want to bring that up because I've heard that phrase used whenever I've talked with sort of science policy colleagues who are in the thick of it, in the weeds, and want to be able to translate it and just feel like they don't have feel like language is the limiting factor to being able to translating this. I want to emphasize that simplifying is not the same thing as dumbing down, because I do think, especially the way that scientific expertise has been politicized in America, especially these days, it's important to keep that in mind, because I think the framing of dumbing something down inherently confesses a hierarchy on the behalf of the speaker, where they're the sort of ones that sort of like talking, and then they're talking to someone who's below them to be able to understand. And again, I don't think it should come as a surprise to anyone in this audience that condescension is not an effective communication strategy. But I think it's something that is not necessarily appreciated well enough in the way that science policy is communicated today. And I do think that you see that in the politicization of how complexity versus simplicity is treated across the aisle in America. I think there's sort of been a growing trend of sort of the way that those on the political left communicate complexity and complex ideas, with a desire for some on the political right for some straightforward ways of communicating ideas. And I think it's important to recognize that, because as science policymakers that are using these complex models and trying to deploy them and use their insights, it's important to understand that in how we communicate science and these model outputs effectively, and that we don't alienate the people that we're trying to convey the importance of these models to. So I will conclude by sort of emphasizing the importance of communicating science effectively and how that applies to the modeling outputs that many of us rely on and leverage and are really powerful tools that we can and should use, but they're only as good as we're able to communicate them to the people in power. So I'll end there.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Nestor, go ahead.
Thanks, Erin. It's great to be back. Let me start by saying all views my own. Nothing representing here Google's visions of the world. And before I share a bit about myself, I just also want to acknowledge that if you work in energy, this is the most exciting time ever in the universe and the history of mankind. There is nothing more exciting than the time we live in right now, because for many years, we were talking about how 2050 and the energy mix and electricity consumption will double or triple or had to change. And suddenly, that is yesterday. And whatever we do today will shape the system, the energy system, for the decades to come. I started with TPP, and actually Fernando, who is now sitting in the audience, was my advisor back then. And we were using models to show how you can actually reduce emissions, decarbonize the electricity system while electricity consumption increases with the technologies that we have, and actually do it in a cost-economical way. I then spent 5 years at McKinsey advising utilities, IPPs, and other strategics on how to do their strategy, how to think about that. And now I can finally say I'm at Google actually doing it. And it's amazing. So again, really, really the most exciting time to be in the energy space. Now, how does this connect to models? I'm going to build on what Erin was saying, that it is true, right? Like, complexity is increasing. We need to be mindful of the inputs that we use, because all of those things will create biases. But I want to go further. I think the challenge that we see today should invite us to rethink everything. Not just the tools that we use, the modeling approach, which also includes bias, the process around how we use these models. How we use these tools to allocate risk. Erin was talking about how if demand doesn't materialize, it will impact ratepayers. Well, why should that be the case? Why can't we use the models to know, quantify what is at stake, and allocate that risk to the proper agents? For the first time, we have a signal in the market that is not policy-driven necessarily, which it has always been a huge risk for any transition. It's economically driven. There are agents willing to pay for this increase in consumption. The scale of these agents is big enough to actually point to them and say, this is a risk that you are creating. This is a cost that you are creating. We need to evolve our tools to be able to actually run faster with greater detail and even leverage AI to simplify the insights or to condensate the insights in something that policymakers can actually use, and really reshape how we plan, how we think about allocation, how we think about technologies. I've read in some places, like some companies are deploying gigawatt scale data centers. A gigawatt scale data center is something so meaningful that thinking of risk allocation through the utility model completely breaks. It's like, why should you be aggregating when you have a gigawatt in a single location? So all to say, I think this is the most exciting time in the energy space. It's challenging, but at the same time, it's a great opportunity, and with great opportunity comes great responsibility. We need to rethink how we do these things. It's not just about the tools. It's not even just how we use the tools. We need to be rethinking the entire process, the policy process, the decision-making process. Everything, in my mind, is up for redesign right now. And it's great to be here. Over to you.
Great, thanks. So I'm so excited to be back as well. I'm Tory. I have loved being able to be on this panel because it really speaks to what I learned in TPP, the reason I came to TPP 15 years ago, kind of bridging analytical insights to actionable decision-making on policy. And I've spent my career in models, building models, running models, training users on models. Then I came to TPP to kind of move into the translation phase. How do we translate models to meaningful insights? And that's what I've been doing over the last decade at E3. Thinking about key questions around, what's the role of states making movement on decarbonization in the face of federal policy headwinds. How do we balance uncertainties and how much data center load is going to materialize? How do we balance investments in the grid related to data centers and other kind of grid hardening, wildfire investments, AMI infrastructure, balance that with customer affordability? How do we integrate transmission and distribution into bulk system planning, kind of bringing together a lot of these kind of disparate parts of decision making into one model and one conversation? And I'll say over the course of my career, when I started 20 years ago, I thought of models as finding the answer or modeling the future, predicting the future. And I'll say I think of models now quite differently. Models are really a way of starting a conversation or continuing a conversation. How do we build trust around a key topic? And at E3, one of the things that's pretty unique about E3 as a consulting firm is we work for everyone in the energy industry. So we work for the public sector, we work for the private sector, and we work for utilities pretty equally, like a third, a third, a third. And that means that your modeling and your analytical insights need to be trusted. You need to come across as objective in order to be able to work with a broad set of stakeholders. So in thinking about, how do we at E3 think about modeling? How do I think about modeling? I kind of came up with 3 insights that I wanted to share around my best practices for using modeling for actionable decision making. And that's that models should be right-sized, models should know their limits, and models should be shared. So this idea of models being right-sized, I was thinking back to when I was in TPP and interviewing for jobs. And I interviewed at E3 and got this question, what's the most complex model you've ever built? And I had this overly confident answer at the time, which was, I don't believe in complex models. I believe in models that are only as complex as they need to be to answer the question at hand. And even though that was probably an overly confident answer in that interview, I stand by it and I think reflects my philosophy on modeling, which is some models need to be complex, yes. If we're modeling, complex 3D surfaces for effective load carrying capability across 40 years of weather data, across many different renewable shapes, and how do we keep a grid reliable? That does need a complex model. But if we're thinking about greenhouse gas inventories, greenhouse gas planning, you can build a very simple version of that model that is more right-sized. Models knowing their limits. I think about this early career mentor that said something to me that stuck with me. That's what counts can't always be counted. And it's this idea that every model has limits. You have to understand what a model can tell you and what it can't tell you. What is the geographic boundary? What is the model well served to tell us? And what can it not tell us? And being able to translate what a model is telling us, where does the analytics end and where does contextualization, where does kind of working with folks to understand the meaning of that model and what it serves to become actionable is really critical. And then finally, this idea of shared modeling. I think there'll be a lot of agreement across this panel and in the room, but I wanted to define some terms about what I mean about shared modeling. I think there's transparency, which is separate from accessibility, which is separate from partnership. So a transparent model could be open source code that's describing your methodology so that people understand what the model does, but that's separate from accessibility. That's a spreadsheet or a model that folks can dig into, or an interface where people can move sliders around. That's actionable insights. That's killer graphics or storytelling with data. And then partnership is bringing people into the conversation. Are you discussing with people what the model methodology is? Are you able to modify assumptions that align with different people's vision of the future? Are you able to look at the results with a group of folks, with a community, and say, let's collaborate on what this means and what we do with the results of this model? And I think maybe En-ROADS is able to check all 3 of those boxes, and that's great. But I think there are limitations in the real world of whether you can always check all 3 of those boxes. Then being intentional about which of those types of sharing is most important for a particular question that a model is trying to answer. And then balancing what does it mean to make something shared, to build trust, and to be able to use modeling for actionable insights. So I'm excited for anyone that's moving into kind of the energy and climate space on modeling. There's so much that we can be doing, as Nestor said, and excited about using models well and intentionally to then translate to actionable insights.
Great. Well, hi, I'm Travis. I'm also excited to be back here. It's so great to be at MIT and to be on the stage. I think One of the things I've just appreciated listening to all the panels, and you'll hear some themes come up in my comments now, is just how great TPP and TMP, an acronym that probably not too many people know these days, but really were towards my skills. The diversity of classes and the breadth of material that we were able to take and integrate across our work has just been amazing, and you hear that across the comments. In my time, both at Climate Interactive, working on C-roads, N-roads, and many other models, I've skipped topics and done a variety of things around like drought and pastoralism in East Africa, flooding in Nigeria, energy modeling in Indonesia, N-roads, C-roads on UN things. And it's just the breadth of materials and the ability to move into so many different disciplines, I think is great. So what I'd like to talk about, I guess, is as I've done and engaged so many different topics with leaders around the world, it's really what are some practices that I've done. And my career has really been focused at some point on impact and change. I did not go directly into academia. I worked for a nonprofit really focused on change. And so maybe I'll start with some themes on that. So one of the most important things when you're really thinking about change and how to integrate into a system is something that an academic would tell you, which is sort of what's your research question. But I think from perspective of change, it's where's the policy opportunity? Listen to the stakeholders, engage the policymakers, focus on the opportunity or the policy window that's forthcoming, and really find the question that those decision makers, the people making that big decision, need answered. So an early example of this in my career was really C-roads. C-roads was a model that was focused on the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, and one of the things that was as they negotiated this one of the first large international treaties on climate change was, are the pledges adding up? Back then, countries were pledging actions, and no one knew whether or not they were going to be sufficient to reach the goal. So we built a model that basically allowed you to take the text of the documents and type on the numbers, and they all have different years and amounts and things like that. But the negotiators didn't have to deal with any of that. The model handled all of the translation into now a unified statistic, like say global temperature, instantly. So you could use it involved in negotiations. And so I think the key lesson there is provide a tool that answers the question that these decision makers need. And in real time, and some of the other things, some of the other themes that you've heard of, I think is really vital. But again, it started with sort of that policy question, what's going to be needed. And it's the same with drought and cross-border migration and all the other topics, is really starting with the question that the policymakers need answered. And I think another thing is to really take a systems approach. So many of these questions, and I think this is something that TPP and TMP and all the programs are really good at, is to take a systems thinking. I use system dynamics, but really to take a systems approach, because that allows you to do something that so many different skills and abilities, but is so vital in the energy system and other modeling, which is to bring in multiple disciplines. Because the questions that policymakers are asking is not necessarily like, how do I build the next gigawatt of renewables? It's really, when we engage ministries in South Africa and Brazil, they're really talking about like, how do we do green development? What's the strategy across jobs, and how do we design the policy frameworks to support the build out of renewables to clean the grid, but also then jobs and all the other economic effects. And so that's going to take a multidisciplinary approach. And as you identify those key issues that are touching the topics, then you know who to bring into the circle. So another good practice is kind of what a little bit was suggested by previous speakers, which is kind of an open and transparent model building process. In system dynamics, we often call this group model building, but there's so many different ways to involve the stakeholders up front. And I think, again, it starts with meetings with ministries or meetings with decision makers, learning their burning questions, working with them, and have a continuous integration of like their viewpoints and the feedback of the modeling process. And as you integrate their knowledge of the system, you can build this model together. And I think that's really vital in creating a transparent and open model, but it's also vital for the acceptance of your results. So again, if you want change, you need to have this trust, and the trust is partly trusting the tool and the insights. But you're also learning together along the way about these complex systems, and it's such a vital process, and it's more important than PowerPoint and PDFs. Stay away from those. Go back to integrated assessments, real-time analysis, anything you can do to get your results in a package that is something that's going to be that they'll remember after they leave the room. So that's the thing is PowerPoint and PDF, people forget, they get so many of them, they never read them. But if you can have an experience, whether it's the group model building, it's the conversations, it's the real-time feedback of an interface, it's some other way. Sometimes we do role-playing exercises and things, but if you can have a more visceral experience with the insights, then it's gonna stick a lot better. And I think I have at least 30 more seconds or something like that, but I'll just say one of the other opportunities around engaging things, and you've heard comments around AI, but but it goes with the theme of bringing in multiple disciplines and really applying systems thinking. But I think don't be afraid of the various tools that are out there, whether it's economics modeling or whether it's system dynamics modeling or agent-based or AI and machine learning. I think there's so many different ways to integrate these things, and I totally agree. It's an exciting time to really bring all of these different tools together into unified modeling frameworks in an open and transparent manner. But really, I think we can answer a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer in the past much better than we can. So I think it's really super exciting, and I think all of my training here has led to this. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I have one question for each of our panelists based on their remarks, but I really encourage anyone to jump in if hearing something sparks some insight that you want to share. So we'll start with Bethany. I think when you were talking, I was thinking about the gap between research and policy advocacy, and I think that always struck me during TPP is how it's not really baked into the academic job formula, and there's some professors that really went out of their way to do it. I'm thinking of people like Jessica Transick, Jesse Jenkins, Leah Stokes, but it's not common, and I wonder how do we use the En-ROADS philosophy of translating this really complicated research into something that people can really understand? How can we bring that approach to other models to make them more publicly accessible?
Sure, yeah, and I think a lot of the other panelists hit on this as well. What we've discovered, and also, I don't want to pretend like I'm the only person that talks to policymakers because all of us do, but is that and Erin, you really said it best, was that simplification doesn't necessarily and dumbing down, this is not what we're trying to do when we're trying to explain complex topics. But I think what you're trying to get at is how do we sort of move this into the classroom? Is that what
I think thinking about the academic path, you're publishing papers, the audience for this is not a policymaker necessarily, and you got to go above and beyond to really translate that work into something that policymakers can use. And so I'm wondering, based on what you've learned and has been effective for En-ROADS, is there a template for how to do this for other types of research?
Yeah, let's see. I think the way that I think about it more is that the people that you mentioned, like Jesse and Leah and others, have somehow figured out a way that to communicate so that they can engage a broader audience. And I think it's because they've figured out that I think it's core to their internal motivation, right? And so part of this is a choice, right? It's a choice as an academic whether or not you want to engage in the policy community. I would say that there is a real desire for truthful information that can be grounded in the best available science, but that there really is a feeling that there's a huge gap. And the best example I have is when we started to engage using En-ROADS. We had a very captive audience on the left, and we had a curious audience on the right. And the curious audience on the right loved the En-ROADS model because, and we have a quote that said, for people who haven't come up with climate science as a background, but are curious, there is this assumption that when we ask simple questions, we're going to be seen and perceived as being dumb. And a model like En-ROADS allows us to ask questions without any kind of judgment. So we can actually just engage with the data ourselves. And so maybe to answer your question, this is a long-winded way of answering a question, is how do we find more ways to allow people whose knowledge is kind of, at the early stage, and this isn't just climate, it could be anything, but people whose knowledge is at the early stage, give them an opportunity and space to be curious without feeling like their questions are dumb, or they're not uninformed, or there's a sense of judgment about them. So, I feel like interactive models like En-ROADS could be, my dream is that we have one for healthcare. There was a PhD student who was doing it on the opioid crisis. Like, all of these interactions and ways to interact with models, my feeling is that we could extend the way that we do it in the energy system to a lot of other topics. It would take a lot of work, but I hope that answers your question, but I think it's just like, let's make it easier for people to ask questions and be curious without making them feel judged, even when there isn't judgment happening. Yeah.
So Nestor, you can jump in.
I just wanted to build on what Tory said on the trade-offs, right? At the end of the day, having a model be interactive comes with a cost. And yes, you're enabling some interaction, which translates into buy-in from stakeholders. But we need to be careful. The system is getting more complex, not less complex. And so there is a point where you might kind of like miss some of those complexities, which actually drive a lot of the answer, on the hopes that you will have something that is super interactive, that everyone can like look and feel, etc. Right? I think there are ways around it. The part of the impact that AI is going to have, I think, is that, right? Like that you can decouple simplicity in the approach in the model from simplicity in the touching and explainability in the ability to interact. But for me, always when I think about this trade-off and focusing particularly on power is one that drives a lot of the challenge, and it's extremely complex. And when you simplify it, the answer that you get looks different. It might tell you like, oh, you need to do all these many gigawatts of solar and wind, when in reality, if you have large loads that consume power 24/7, what you should be doing is a bunch of nuclear, right? Just to say an example, right? And so how do you make sure that loss in translation is something that we're upfront with policymakers or the stakeholders, and we frame this as like, hey, I made simplicities or simplifications. The answer you're seeing here is just like a beautified version of it. It's not the actual number or pathway, right? I think that's a key point that I like to stress when talking about models.
Great. Erin, when you were speaking, I thought about the incentive misalignment problem, where especially as utilities are seeing this opportunity for load growth due to data centers, they have an incentive to build. Customers have the opposite incentive. They want low rates, and tech companies might have a very different incentive. They're trying to push forward models to be competitive and to innovate. And so I wonder, how do you educate policymakers about that incentive misalignment challenge in a way they can understand? And in conversations you've had with state lawmakers, what sort of messages and analogies kind of make that click, or sort of challenges that you've seen in making that point stick with them?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think focusing, especially with policymakers, on what their vision of success looks like in order to contextualize how these models are arriving or not arriving at that vision of success. And so for utility regulators, the job is to produce electricity that is reliable and affordable, and I work in an environmental nonprofit, so we also want it to be clean. And achieving all of those objectives is very, very difficult, but understanding that if that is the objective and how different incentives are motivating different players in the system to either meet that target or not meet that target, I find is what is most effective in conveying that point. And I think maybe hearkening back to Bethany's point about how to bridge the gap between some of these economic modeling insights and sort of meeting policymakers where they're at, I think creating the space to ask questions is really valuable, because I think it allows you to actually tailor in and meet a listener where they're at, because the questions one person is going to ask is going to be a very different question than what another person is going to ask. Because I think with the rule of economics, and it's true of people too, is people are motivated by incentives, and what are those incentives and what are you trying to achieve? They're not all monetary for people, but especially when you have a regulatory compact like a utility, being able to just sort of like emphasize, I think, that point that people and entities are motivated by incentives, and how do those motivations shape what different parties are advocating for, and how will that help you achieve your goal? So I would focus on that.
Great, thank you. Nestor, I had a question for you. So you had talked about how in this new era of grid planning, that with loads so large, you can actually attribute certain costs to direct projects because they have such an outsized influence on this planning, and that kind of leads to a new class of modeling and how we need to really be rethinking this redesign of how you conduct that modeling and how you do cost allocation. I'm wondering who is sort of in the best position to lead that. I know there's a lot of different people in the room. They're grid operators, utilities, regulators, state lawmakers. In your mind, who is sort of in the best position to be pushing that conversation forward? And then who might we want to pull in that historically have not been included in those types of planning conversations?
Let me clarify one thing. Because when people think about like this change in the system, they tend to anchor on data centers. And data centers are not the only large load. And if we think about what we want to achieve by 2050 with decarbonization and all those things, you need to electrify industries. And so we're at a time where we need to be thinking about a bigger group, large loads, things that will consume a lot of electricity and like a very big point of consumption. I do think to address your question, I mean, at the end of the day, because you will end up in interacting with the utilities, I think they need to be driving. That there's no way around it. How they drive, I think, is something that, in my hope, is it will change. Right now, they run their RFP like maybe twice a year or maybe once a year. It's a very slow process, etc. No, like they use tools that are usually, like black box, paid for, something like that. We have the tools, we have had them, like we're still doing capacity expansion the same way that we were doing it 10 years ago. So we can make the tools way better with AI and all the different advancements in computing, etc. But again, back to my point, I think the process needs to change, right? It has to be something that is more iterative, maybe something that is even live, where I can drop a new large load and I can see the impact in the cost, the impact in the grid build out. Things that, I mean, it's not going to be perfect. It's the first layer of the analysis, but something that can help me find out, okay, where do I drop a large load and I create the least impact or the most value to the system? Because these loads, we see them as liabilities. They don't have to be liabilities. They can be grid assets. We just need to change the way we're thinking. Thinking of a load as just like a one-directional type of element in the system, it's like the mindset of 10 years ago. In the future, just like we have with electromobility and all that, we need to be thinking, okay, like all these large loads in the future can have on-site batteries, can have on-site generation, can be smart and like adjust their operation. That is an asset. It can create capacity. It can help you manage, when the grid is constrained, et cetera. And so I think that the conversation needs to start with the utilities, but the utilities need help, right? Like they have a way of operating. They have been operating this way for many, many years. The way we have been doing things for the past 10 years in no way can deliver what we need for the next 10, right? Load in the US was flat at best over the past 10 years. So we have a process that uses models, a way of making decisions that uses models, but that is used to a very narrow set of the pathways, right? It's the pathways where everything's marginal, everything is a little bit here and there. Right now, we need to be thinking a step function changes everywhere.
Yeah, I will maybe respond because I fully agree with Nestor that we need to do planning and building out our system much more differently than we have been doing for the past 10 years. And I think I might suggests that doing some planning for accommodating some large loads, because you're right, it's not just AI and data centers, will require some more comprehensive planning models than what we've used in the past. And particularly if utilities lead, I think, the push, these entities typically plan the system for within their footprint. And especially in the New England context, we've seen a lot of investment in sort of local distribution upgrades over the past 10, 20 years. All of that is great. It's designed to meet some of the sort of load where it's materializing and some of the resources that are coming online, especially with the advent of larger quantities of renewables. However, I think when you look especially at the New England system, those investments, because they're focused on many smaller projects within a utility footprint, are not necessarily planned the best to meet the region's needs at large. So I think how some of these models are incorporated outside of individual utility silos, how we do comprehensive system planning to sort of incorporate distribution planning as well as transmission planning region-wide, and forcing utilities to actually talk to each other and maybe regulate some of how some of those assets are built, I think is going to be paramount. So.
Tory, I saw you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that too, because this is such an interesting topic. Taking a big step back when we think about affordability, electric rates have been going up everywhere. Some of that is inflation, but a lot of that is that we've been needing to invest in our grid that was built post-war and is all quite old, from distribution through transmission all the way up through the entire system, and load has been flat for the last 15 years. So if we think about the basic rate-making principles, increased investment over flat load is roughly going to turn into higher rates per customer. And so as we think about the role of large loads and data centers, could be not just data centers, but it is largely, we're talking about data centers right now in a lot of markets. We did this really cool study for the state of Virginia. I think lots of folks may have heard this statistic that 70% of all internet traffic passes through Northern Virginia. A ton of data centers already exist there. It's also a key data center market. But one of the things that we did is kind of do some analysis around what has been the cost shift to date of data centers that already exist in Northern Virginia back to customers, and how do you think about that going forward? So I can't explain that whole study, but I will call one of my favorite graphics, which goes back to one of my other points around, how do we translate effectively modeling? Sometimes it's just one key infographic. And so one that I loved that this team made at E3 is called the whale in the bathtub. And it's this idea that if your grid is the bathtub, sometimes you've got small incremental loads. That's vehicle electrification, building electrification. You can fill up the bathtub with a little bit more water, but you don't need a new bathtub. That's going to increase load for your existing system that you already have headroom for. That's going to start decreasing rates over time, greater load for the same system. Maybe you have loads in the middle where maybe you need some minor distribution system upgrades, some small, maybe you have to take a few things out of the bathtub, all the bath toys. I've got young kids at home, to make space in the bathtub for the new loads. But the whale in the bathtub is your data center. It's your large load. You probably need a bigger bathtub to make space for the whale. And that's a huge amount of new investment in the grid. And so thinking about then the cost allocation for those new investments is really critical. And there is a lot of thinking about this. I think improved models can help, but also just the thought around how do we design tariffs for new data centers and who pays for those upgrades. First, you need the modeling to say, what will this trigger? And then who pays for that? Because if it's basically due to the new data center should carry a large portion of that, but then other customers also benefit from it. So I think that's still an open conversation around exactly how we do that.
Great. We'll come back to you, Tory, for my next question based on what you talked about. I think I loved the quote about models should only be as complex as they need to be. And I imagine when you're working with clients, they're not, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not coming to you and saying, please use a Monte Carlo model for this. Maybe the state of California is the one exception. I'm wondering, you have the technical experts and you're going to your clients who might not necessarily have that modeling expertise. How do you balance that trade-off where you have, I'm sure TPP graduates who are coming ready to use the latest state-of-the-art model, and then in your head you're thinking maybe, okay, we don't need to use this because the output needs to be legible and needs to be something stakeholders can trace. So I wonder how you balance that tension when you take on new projects to make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I could spend a very long time answering this question, so I'll try to make it short. I think it really depends on the project. It comes back to this right-sized modeling question. I think there are some questions. We do a lot of projects for commissions like the CPUC or MassC, Mass DOER on like rate design. We think about rate design principles. That doesn't need a complex model. And if the goal is to bring different stakeholders along, that's where you build a spreadsheet tool. It's a simple spreadsheet tool. It can be available. You can do certain amounts of workshops, give people the ability to play around. We did this in California with the income graduated fixed charge proceeding. This idea of, should we create income tiers for how we redistribute rates? And so we built a spreadsheet tool and let different stakeholders build their own preferred rate structure and let them submit that back. That required a certain amount of expertise to be able to contribute, but we also tried to do workshops and help different groups. So we had advocates, we had utilities, basically respond with their own proposals. And so I think that was right-sized for that project. We also do support utilities with really detailed IRP modeling. Though the models haven't changed that much in the last 10, 15 years, I do think we are increasingly adding complexity. I gave the example of kind of how do you model reliability for a highly renewable grid. We are learning a lot about how to better reflect changes in weather, changes in renewable profiles. How do you think about extreme weather and climate impacts? And so we are consistently trying to evolve that question. And then it comes back to, if that model is not going to be accessible, in the sense that you're not going to get your average stakeholder to run ELCC surface model that's embedded with machine learning. How can you make it accessible in other ways? Can you make the methodology transparent? Can you have spreadsheets of inputs and outputs? Can you bring folks along in the conversation at every step of the process so that even though the model is complex, there's still trust building involved?
And Travis, thank you. You've been very patient. Coming to you next. So I think when you spoke about kind of bridging these divides between different communities with different levels of technical sophistication, I thought of, in our work, we've been doing, trying to get utilities to do integrated distribution planning and incorporating stakeholder engagement. And you can imagine a public listening session where somebody's going to come in and share their feedback, and that's not necessarily immediately translatable to a model. So I wonder, as you were talking about sort of workforce development and having this iterative process working with ministries in different parts of Africa, I'm wondering how do you bridge that divide and sort of how do you take a model and then incorporate feedback that's not necessarily going to be here's an input assumption, but something more qualitative that then you could use to actually iterate and go forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's probably at least two parts of an answer, and maybe I'll just divide it into sort of the front end and the back end. So the front end, of course, I was kind of alluding to sort of group model building, which is where you'd have, try to identify up front the stakeholders that would be affected. And I'll just say one of the countries we do a ton of work in is South Africa, and they have a very participatory process for so many of their different policies and things, where they really bring in labor unions and they bring in government and various stakeholders, utilities, and energy planning. And so that's putting the stakeholders in the room up front and kind of helping identify the key questions. And I think that is one way to bring their input in and then start building a model from those mental models and the questions that they're raising and the issues and the metrics, if you want to come down to that are vital to see before making the actual policy. And then I think the other part of your question was sort of like on the back end, where you've got this model, you've got the results, the utility's having its public hearing or something like that, and how do you communicate the results? Of course, there's great infographics, real-time tools and things to help communicate that are different than PowerPoint and PDFs. But I think another thing that I mentioned briefly, what is a little more unique too, is if there's a way to devise experiences around the communication of the results. And now public hearings, probably not. Like some forums are pretty rigid and in their structure. But depending on the stakeholder group, can you have an experience, a role play exercise that would bring still the variety of stakeholders, civil society, government, businesses, private sector, anyone who needs to be involved. And can you bring them into an experience that has that shared learning, where they're gaining the insights from the study, the research, the model, but they're doing it in a different way, and they're actually, in some ways, having a conversation with each other. So an example of this, not in the energy sector, but the first one that comes to mind, is sort of like we're doing this at Tufts with around emergency response. But it's related to climate because one of the things they're doing is gaming out the idea that, well, there's long tails of these extreme weather events. We mentioned extreme weather events affecting the grid. Of course, there's responses in emergency response. So can these, these emergency response teams in the government, the departments, they know how to respond pretty well to the 1 in 10 year and the 1 in maybe 100 year flood or event or heat wave. But what about that 1 in 500 year that they've never experienced? Can we game that out? Can they learn from it? Can we run it through a model? Can we interact with the insights? And then if we bring in civil society and all the other organizations that would be involved in the response, is there a learning process there that would improve this system resilience and that kind of thing? And there are, of course, analogies that we could bring back into the energy sector, so sorry to go off the panel topic. But I think that that's a way to really focus on communications, both on the front end and the back end.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one question, and then I have a last rapid fire question for our panelists. Does anyone have anything they're dying to ask? I see Kaylin in the back from way downtown.
Is this on? Yeah? Okay, great. Hi, thanks. Yeah, really interesting topic. Thanks for all coming, and good to see a lot of familiar faces again. My name's Kaylin Graham. I graduated in 2024 from TPP, and I'm now an energy associate at the Brattle Group, where we've been working on a lot of these issues. And I agree with Nestor on the topic around this being a very, very exciting time. I'm just going to take this out. A very exciting time in the energy industry, and changing a lot of interesting topics. I definitely feel that from a work perspective. And then when I take that hat off and I put on maybe the hat that's drove me to join TPP and join this space, which is interested in decarbonization and the climate impacts, it's a kind of, to me, a bit of a scary time, actually. We're in a policy environment where obviously not entirely favorable for renewable energy. We had one of the biggest pieces of climate policy ever just repealed. And at the same time, we have this large load, the emergence of this large load, where we talk a lot about cost externalities, but we don't often talk about climate externalities. And there are some large players, Google being one of them, that are doing a lot of active thinking in this space. But my concern often arises with, for every Google, there's a lot of other players in the system who are really just concerned about getting online as quickly as possible. And so I guess my question is, when we're talking about, because I agree that the new paradigm that we're in needs to rethink the utility business, the utility regulation structure. How do we do that in a way that doesn't lose sight of the other decarbonization objectives that have been, if we had this panel a year and a half ago, we'd be talking about completely different things. We'd be talking about that. We'd be talking about how do we decarbonize electric vehicles or heat. And as we tackle with these emerging issues, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of those and we try to deal with those, both of those issues at the same time. And so I guess I would like to get the panel's views on how we can do both. I know there's some examples with, say, the clean transition tariff in Nevada, for example, that Google was very involved in. But yeah, I guess I'd like to hear the views on the panel on how we can keep an eye on that longer term objective as well as dealing with this really near-term amazing opportunity.
Travis.
So I'll give a quick plug for Climate Interactive. One of the spin-offs of that nonprofit is another nonprofit called Multisolving Institute, multisolving.org. And at least one of the key things is really being able to hold 2 or 3 priorities simultaneously. I think it's actually a great opportunity, because if you can have multiple things, whether it's health, energy system, and everything else, and carbon, you can actually build broader coalitions. And so that's a different framework, a different paradigm of approaching problems that is very useful. But I think coming back to maybe the modeling point is dashboards. I don't think there's any particular way that you can do a lot of modeling with just a single metric for as much as we'd like. So I think dashboards are something that we've learned are very vital, where you actually can see on a single screen maybe multiple different dimensions of the problem and the solution, because you're running scenarios. There's, anyway, I think of useful things is running scenario modeling, not necessarily optimization modeling for a lot of the complex questions that I think that you're trying to handle. So, but that was my answer.
We may all have an answer to this one. I mean, I've been building these 2050 pathways models for 20 years. We're not really learning anything new from those models anymore. I think there's a lot of benefit from bringing folks along in those models to make sure everyone understands, here are the key levers that we need to pull, here's the optionality, low-hanging fruit, but broadly we know what we need to do to be on the right track to 2050. And so what I've been really focused on the last 10 years, and especially the last 5 years, is how do we bring forward what are just the next steps? Can we make sure we're taking action, getting closer to implementation, getting financing and projects done in the near term? And so then you need to understand for all of these projects, who are the decision makers and how do we move the needle in the near term? That is exciting in some ways because you're actually seeing things get done. It's less exciting in others because you're focused on one part of the problem and then you see this big gap between now and 2050. But I think we need to do both. And then I think the other thing I would say is everyone has their own theory of change around how do we do the near-term steps best. And it's probably defined a little bit by all of us in what role we're in now, likely defines what our personal theory of change is. Do you do that through academia, training the next batch of students, doing these workshops with key decision makers? Do you do that through consulting, by going and working with key folks that are making decisions right now? How do you get their next project financed? How do you work with a regulatory commission that's trying to make a decision in the next cycle? Do you work at a technology company that's working on their set of data centers and decisions that need to be made? But all of these pieces we need for the near-term next step. So I think for anyone that's thinking about what your next role is, it's partially what's your theory of change to continue to make some progress in the near term where you think there's the most impact, in addition to keeping in mind the long-term trajectory that we need to be on.
Thanks. I am having flashbacks to the TPP lightning thesis talks because we're being flashed with a 30-second warning, and I'm sure Franck will come up and cut us off. So I will find you later and ask and get your question.
Can I get a quick question in, which Richard Tabor's old TPP on the faculty side and also responsible for putting at the same time together that developed the math of locational marginal pricing and locational marginal emission rate type stuff. But the question I have really for you is how do you look at, when you're looking at simulation modeling, how do you look at the relationship between AI and the physical modeling part of it? And then a second question is how granular do you need to be or do you feel you need to be in the modeling?
Can someone take that in 30 seconds? No.
I can go. Granular, Tory said it best, right-size models, that kind of thing. Detail when necessary for the bigger questions, but I think you've got to model the problem, which is sort of one of the points that I led off with. I think AI, in my opinion, and I know Nestor is going to have other solutions, I think AI can be integrated as part of the solution. So one of the things I was saying is, I think in systems loops, I want AI to be embedded in loop as a fancier way to do approximation. It can also, of course, be a more answer model, but I think there's lots of different ways to integrate it into modeling that's appropriate for the tasks. So I don't know if anyone has a 10-second answer.
Nestor, do you have? I cut you off before, so do you have?
No, I agree. I believe what we are seeing AI do now is just the tip of the spear. I don't think anyone in this room can imagine what we're going to have AI do in 5 years from now. And AI can write model. Fernando doesn't like when AI is writing the capacity optimization code, but AI can do it. And so there is no reason not to have AI actually do these things for us at a faster pace and do the entire cycle. And then, of course, we need to digest and we need to decide.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. And